So I saw a Ford Ranchero for sale and I bought it. A friend of mine gave me a ride to pick up the Ranchero. My ride had to leave, so I am now in the middle of nowhere with nothing but a Ranchero that barely runs. Oh, and a single toolbox. So this is my gas tank right here. The original gas tank has a crack in it. This is the line that goes into it. This has an aftermarket electric fuel pump on it. This is the interior. None of the lights work on the inside at this juncture. The rear brakes, the rubber hose that goes to the differential is broken, so I have no rear brakes, only front brake. I've got to say, the hood on this thing is huge. I mean, this is the longest vehicle ever. So it has a tendency, it runs great actually, but it has a tendency to die at idle, so I'm going to see if I can find any vacuum leaks with it. Shifter doesn't work, by the way. It falls into reverse. I don't have a license plate. Please go. High idle equals cruise control. I hope my brake lights work. I have no idea what works and what doesn't. I didn't ask questions. I just gave the guy some cash and I drove away. It's probably 25 through here, but my idle isn't low enough to achieve that. This is the last year they made Ranchero, 1979. Don't ask where I am because I would be embarrassed to tell you exactly how lost I am. Only 5 gallons of gas, so I better figure this out. Tucson city limits? What have I done? You know, right about now, I'm wishing I hadn't poured an entire quart of ATF onto the exhaust manifold. It's not smelling too good. Okay, and it just died. Right. There's no such thing as park. I gotta say, this shit lights up. Dude, 10 out of 10. Might start easier with the battery. The steering wheel's locked. I'm trying to decide whether or not it's going to roll straight or whether I'm going to regret this. And I'm going to regret this. Hey Balin, quit hogging all the public parking spaces. It won't lock itself from the outside, but it will unlock itself from the outside. Guess I'd better bring my the entirety of my gas tank inside, you know, so nobody steals it. You can steal an empty bottle of ATF if you so choose. Yeah, that's the thing. Wow, that's very rusted out, Jesus. There are 0 screws holding this tailgate together. Anyway, I'm going to call it a night. That is a Ford Ranchero. Alright, so today we're going to fix up the old Ranchero. So the first thing I did is we have a vacuum leak somewhere, so I just went through and I deleted a lot of the emissions system. Let me go show you how I decided what to delete and what to not delete. Alright, so this thing here is controlled by vacuum and also temperature, and what this does is this, when it's really cold outside, it closes off this opening here, and it forces the intake to suck air from over on top of the exhaust manifold to help the engine heat up faster. Unless you're living in Wisconsin, you don't need that, and it wasn't hooked up anyway, so I just disconnected the line for that. The next thing was the vacuum line for the Spark Advanced. That was hooked up to the engine through this thing, and this just controls the amount of vacuum the Spark Advanced gets relative to the temperature of the engine. You don't need it. I mean, these engines have run for years and years without them. So I just disconnected the lines from that, and I ran the Spark Advance straight up to ported vacuum, not manifold vacuum. Ported basically just means there's no vacuum at idle, and then it gives you vacuum once you crack open the throttle. There was another one of these things here, that green thing that controls vacuum based on temperature. There was another one here that was broken off already when I got it, so obviously I just deleted that. There's this vacuum line here that went all the way down to this little canister down there, and I just looked at those lines, and you can just kind of tell what is and what isn't necessary. And if you don't have to pass emissions where you're at, you can just delete things that, whether they're working or not, if they're not really necessary, you can delete them. You might be better off to leave them, but meh. So that went down there. And this, I can't remember if that went to the tank or what that went to. I just disconnected that, and I hooked this that vacuum line up to the other side there, so you can see now there's just a T right there. The T was capped, I just uncapped it, and then that just goes to the crankcase to vent the crankcase, so that's fine. There's a vacuum line going to this box here, this can. The other end of this line here goes to nothing, so obviously this is already disconnected, there's nothing else here. So I disconnected the vacuum line from that because it's clearly not doing anything, and I ended up just hooking this line here up to this thing over there because I deleted something there and I deleted something here, so I connected them together so that we don't have any vacuum leaks. I just noticed this. This is probably a leak right there. You can see, yeah, if that'll focus. I'm probably going to have to deal with that because that is probably already a vacuum leak. This line is necessary, so I'm not going to, disconnect that line. Let's see, this goes to manifold, and it just goes to this T here to provide vacuum to this T, which provides vacuum to this fucking tree. But yeah, I'll check that, make sure I can get that so that doesn't leak. Now that I think about it, there was a steel line here. You can see this hose right there. That one went to the gas tank, and you can see it connects to a steel line right there, and that steel line goes down on top of the transmission back in there. I actually left that connected because if I disconnect it, of course, the gas tank is just going to spew fumes out here on top of the engine, so I might as well leave it connected. At some point I might disconnect it from the tank, but we'll see. That yellow thing down there that was hooked up to this kind of weird valve mechanism, and that was hooked up to vacuum, and that was hooked up to this top of the carburetor here. That should just be a vent for the float bowl where I had that rubber line hooked up now. That had like a one-way valve and like, I don't know, maybe vacuum, not really sure exactly how that was working because it was hooked up to this weird valve system. I just disconnected that and I ran this line just off into the distance there. That'll come out just inside this fender here, in between the inner and outer, metal pieces there. So that'll just be vent. So when the fuel flows in, it'll displace air, and that air will, with basically very little resistance because there's no volume, that little line is perfectly fine. If there's a high volume of air being displaced, that little line would restrict it, but because it's just a little bit of air, that'll just make sure that that float bowl is always at atmospheric pressure, never gets pressurized, and it never, once it becomes pressurized, of course, it'll stop fuel from flowing in. But there's a long vacuum line going to this little switch over here. I left that connected just because I don't want to dick around with a computer system that's fighting me if it senses it doesn't have vacuum, because it'll try to cut things off. I don't know, it probably won't kill the engine, but it'll do weird things if it doesn't have vacuum. So I'm going to leave that. If I still have a vacuum leak at idle, and it still seems like it's a little weird, I can check that. What you do to check if something's working, what you do is you just put your mouth on the vacuum line and you just suck. So, for example, that might be good to do on the Spark Advance, just to make sure that that rubber diaphragm in there is still intact. You just disconnect the line so that, one end is just floating, the other end is connected to the Vacuum Advance or the switch or whatever diaphragm. You put that nasty little thing in your mouth and you suck on it, you get a vacuum on it. What I like to do is after I get a vacuum, I just rest my tongue against the opening, and the vacuum kind of sucks my tongue on there. And then I just sit there for a second, just with not pushing my tongue, just my tongue just limp, and the vacuum will hold my tongue on there. And as long as it holds my tongue, it's good. If it loses vacuum, and I can feel it on my tongue lose vacuum, and then my tongue falls off, then I know obviously this is leaking. So then that would need to be dealt with. The shifter kept coming out, so all I did is I just got a nail, found it on the ground right there. I broke off the extra nail so it wouldn't stab myself, just dropped it in there, and now it's just held in place by gravity. You got to be careful when you insert the shifter. There's a spring thing, and you can feel it. So what happens is, so if you have this in neutral, and you just push it up, it won't go into reverse. You have to have it lined up with that spring thing. So you pull the lever towards you, you can feel that spring, and then it will allow you to go to reverse and park. Let go, it'll spring back, and it'll be stuck in park. It won't just drop out of park. I took off this front cover on the tailgate, and I found about 2.5 tons of landscaping in here. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go through and we're gonna, I don't know if you can see in there, shovel all that out, and I went dumpster diving and got a box. We're just going to fill up a box with landscaping. Well, not quite as impressive as I thought. It's only like 1.25 tons, but cleaned out all right. I got most of it. I got all the big rocks, so there's probably still some dust in there. Hopefully that'll fly out. This didn't have all the screws it needed to hold it in place, but I actually conveniently have some spares that are exactly right. They're from a Ford, and they'll fit in there perfectly. They're tapered and everything, so they'll align it. So let's throw that on there. Nice. All right, it's another day. I still had a vacuum leak, so this steel line right there, the one that goes down behind the engine, that goes to the vacuum modulator. I crawled down on the ground and I unscrewed the vacuum modulator and I put a rubber hose on it and I sucked on it and it held vacuum, so I know that diaphragm is good, but this still had a leak, so what I did is I got a new rubber hose for this steel line there. So I got a replacement rubber hose for that. I got a replacement rubber hose for this thing that was cracked that I told you I was going to replace and never got around to. And then we got this little fellow over here. Now this, so you see that blue thing? Behind the blue thing, that's another diaphragm. That's a very large diaphragm, and that is for the EGR, the exhaust gas recirculation. So this, based on the amount of vacuum, it controls how much exhaust gases are put into the intake manifold, and that has some numbers on it. So I sucked on that, and it just sucked air. I couldn't get anything to move. You know, I couldn't detect any movement inside of there. So I have determined that this diaphragm is bad. Rather than pay $80 for a new one, I'm just gonna leave this open, and then I blocked off where the vacuum line was hooked up to that. It would run slightly cleaner with that. I mean, if that didn't have a leak, I'd like to leave it connected, but because it's $80 and because the thing will run just fine without it, I'll leave it. That will cool off the engine just a little bit, having that exhaust gas in there, which seems counterintuitive, but it actually will. But again, because it has a cracked diaphragm or a broken diaphragm, and because it's $80, there's no way. So hopefully when I hook this all up, I won't have any more vacuum leaks. Famous last words. Alright, so this thing just randomly died, and I'd pumped the pedal a couple of times, which would actuate this accelerator pump, which would squirt fuel directly into the intake, and then it would fire up and it would run, and then it would very shortly thereafter die. So I knew it was dying because it was too lean, and I was fiddling with the choke trying to get it to run. It wouldn't run, and finally it wouldn't even start, you know, when I pumped the accelerator pump. So I came out here, and of course you push the accelerator pump and you listen, and so you can hear that's dry. It almost squirted once, but it's dry. So I know that the float bowl is empty. So then what I did is, the first thing, so I ended this screw with the fuel pump running, and then I just wiggled that line. I got it to spray fuel, so I knew I had fuel pressure. If you have a mechanical pump like this thing is supposed to, and eventually will, what you do is you disconnect this completely, then you crank it over like once, and it should spray fuel everywhere, and that's how you know. When that engine turns over and it hits the fuel pump, it should go and fuel everywhere, and then you know you got fuel. So if we have fuel here and we don't have fuel in the intake, we know that there's no fuel in the float bowl, because of course the accelerator pump isn't working, but we have fuel going into the carburetor. And so sure enough, that float is supposed to be roughly level, and you can see that it's down, even though earlier I had the fuel pump running, there was nothing coming into here. So I have a clog. So we're gonna take that float out and we're gonna deal with this clog. Super easy to take this carburetor apart, by the way. There's just a bunch of screws. This is the only exception. So you just take out those screws and the top pops right off. There's just like one hose you got to disconnect. Depending on your vehicle, you may or may not have that rubber hose. This screw right here, this smaller one, all I did was I unscrewed this little arm from the choke butterfly, and so then this has a little a square hole there, and that'll accept that, and so this will just pop back on. So when I put this back together, if I can show you there, you see this will line up. See right there. Oh, yep, there we go. Yeah, so you can see this will line up. So this only goes on one way, of course. So when I put the screw back in, that'll go back in correctly. So that's all I had to do, is I just took that out to get that choke off, and this comes apart super easy. And as long as you're gentle and you don't get dirt in there and you don't make a mess, you'll actually save the gasket just fine. And you can reuse this gasket. So just, you know, don't get it dirty and don't throw it off a cliff. You'll be fine. So there's a single clip holding the float in place. I removed the needle from the seat. No fuel came out when I turned on the fuel pump. So I unscrewed the seat and fuel started coming up, so I know that this is clogged, and sure enough, there it is. So very carefully, without damaging that seat, I'm gonna have to clean this out. Alright, so I put the disgusting fuel encrusted thing in my mouth, this end clog, and I blew, clog came right out. Put a little bit of Coca-Cola in my mouth, blew it through here just to get any little residual particulates. I wouldn't want anything to clog the seat, of course, or hold it open, because sometimes it'll flood if you get a little particle that stops the seat from closing. And then I dried this off, so this is now dry, and of course it's a little tiny, so it's had a second air dry, so there's essentially no water left on here. So we're going to reassemble, and it goes back together just as easy as it came apart. So I'm sorry. So we put this in here, and then we'll just get it started, make sure it's threading before we actually put a wrench on it. All right, and just throw a wrench on there and just give it just a gentle snug. I guess that's a little bit more than a gentle snug. If it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing. All right, now we're going to take our float, and you see, okay, so that seat will just drop right in there, and then this little bar here that has two little grooves that it lines into, you see there's one there and there's one on the other side. And now this little ring right here will go down, and that'll snap, boink, just like that, and boom, we are reassembled. All right, and that float looks pretty close to level, so here was what we'll do to test it. Oh boy. It makes me a little nervous with it bubbling like that. Here's what we'll do. We'll just spray fuel everywhere. Yeah, hold up. Okay, so I removed the float. Now we say a prayer and put the float back in. That should clear up any particulates that were holding the float open. Should thusly allows the float to close, and pray I don't hydraulic my motor. All right, so I turn the fuel pump on. There appears to be no leaking here. So yeah, you can see that it's sealed. So here's what we'll do. We'll push this down, we should see fuel, and I let go, no more fuel. So all that was just a particulate in there. That was, just like I said, of course, between the needle and the seat. You know, the needle is pointed, the seat accepts that point, and it seals. And when you get a particulate in there, boop, it doesn't let it close all the way. And so it, yeah, but we got it now. So I'm gonna put this back together, and most importantly, I'm gonna let it sit for a little bit before I crank it. Because if I crank it right now, I'm worried that enough fuel leaked in there that there'll be all that fuel in a cylinder, and the piston will go up and it'll hit all that fuel. Fuel does not compress, liquids do not compress, air does, and so you'll blow through a piston. More than likely you'll blow a head gasket, what have you. I'm gonna let this sit and let some of it'll evaporate, and some of it'll, if it's in a cylinder, it'll leak past the rings, and so hopefully that'll work itself out. Should have been more prepared, man. This thing blew black smoke everywhere, but yeah, I revved it up a little bit and burned through it, and now sounds pretty nice. So let's see if we can get it to idle and do all the things it's supposed to do. The steel part of the power steering line rubbed through because it was rubbing on that piece of metal. It was like that when I got it. So I was able to get a big wrench on here, on this end of the power steering line. I was able to get that cracked loose because I got a new line, of course. And so I wasn't able to get this other side here cracked loose. I couldn't get the big wrench on it. There wasn't enough space. And I was able to get this little wrench in here. You can see, no matter how hard I pried, I couldn't get this little wrench to turn. But never fear, there's an old Indian trick for that. I don't know if you can see it here, but there's a hook through the hole in there. And then over here we got just this ratchet strap. You can see down here. It's a ratchet strap, and so you do is you just hold on to the wrench, you make sure it doesn't flop around. You tighten down your ratchet strap and boink, cracks it loose. Well, somebody must have changed the pump around or something, because the parts store doesn't sell what I need, the power steering line. I need 2 flared ends. The only one they sell for this vehicle is one flared and one with an O-ring that pivots, and they don't have any for any other vehicles in stock that'll fit, so soldered it up. It's right here. that it was leaking, and I just soldered over here for good measure because it was also rubbing there, so it's a little bit thinner, but this is where the leak was. So yeah, it's fine. It's only a hydraulic system, so it's just like 2,000 psi, nothing special. All right, so this thing was still pouring fuel, and I figured out the needle and seat still wasn't sealing. Like it more often than not, it gets to a position where it won't seal. So I got from O'Reilly, I got a rebuild kit for this carburetor for like 20 bucks, $19.99 plus tax. And so I pulled this carburetor off of here, and I replaced any gaskets I encountered along the way. And you can't see it, but underneath it here, and actually I can show you well, I guess it's underneath that float, but there's a power valve down there. And so I replaced that power valve with that rebuild kit, which is a good thing because that power valve was really, really stiff, and it was leaking a little bit of fuel past the diaphragm, which obviously it's not supposed to do. So that was a good thing I did that, put a new needle and seat in it, and then while I was in here, I adjusted this thing. So you can see that screw. Well, I guess you can't because it won't focus. There's a screw, or a bolt, I should say, right there. And then that copper-colored bracket, and then there's that one little pin, oh, come on, right there, and there's another little pin behind it. So what this does is this is actuated by a cam on the throttle. Let me see if I can show you this here. So when I push down the gas pedal, lifts those up, and you see those rods are tapered, almost like kind of like bowling pin shaped, bigger at the bottom, smaller at the top. And so what that does is that fills up those little holes. Those go into these holes, and so right now they're more open, and it kind of tapers and kind of closes off that hole. Now what those two holes are air bleed-off holes. And so what happens is when you push the pedal down, it seals up those holes, which creates a greater pressure differential, which allows this engine to draw more fuel through the jets and through these venturis here. So, and of course, when those are down, it allows more air to bleed off, which decreases the pressure differential, and that it gives you slightly less fuel. It pulls slightly less fuel. So what I did is, while I was in here, is I loosened that screw, or that bolt, and I lifted up that bracket, because that bracket is adjustable, and I lifted it up, and it only came up about 1/16 of an inch, but I pulled it up. What that does is that pulls those little rods up, and it'll make it ever so slightly richer. The difference isn't major. It's not much of a difference, but it'll make it a little bit richer, and that'll help kind of counteract the fact that these things are all plugged up so that they can pass emissions, and so that'll give me slightly more power. I'm going to gain more than I'm going to lose. I'm going to gain like 1/4 horsepower, and I'm going to lose like, a 100th of a mile per gallon. So it's a step in the right direction. Obviously, it's adjusting that bracket isn't going to make this thing a power monster, but it's definitely going to make it slightly better. So, because these things are running really lean so that they pass emissions. So this air conditioning is R12, and obviously this is upside down. As you can actually see right on there it says Refrig 12. Does not play well with others. But yeah, left hand side is printed in red. It's not actually stamped in there, so you can actually read it. R12 basically. This has pressure in the system. Now this here, if you look at this compressor, there's only one valve, and this is the valve on the high pressure side. You don't want to touch that. But if you look, there's like, well, where the heck is the valve for the low end? That's actually all the way over here. You actually got to come almost to where the evaporator is, and down underneath here, there's your low pressure valve. Pardon my tremor. And so it's illegal to release R12 into the atmosphere, so I definitely didn't do that. But I pulled that cap off, and I tested to see if there was any pressure in here without releasing any R12 into the atmosphere, of course. And there is, I don't know how much, but I know there is pressure in here. A lot of people swear by heat. They say you heat something up and it'll come right off, and they're exactly right. I had this drum here was rusted on. It was stuck. I soaked it in oil overnight, and I was hammering on it, and it would not budge. I couldn't even get it to even just wiggle just a little bit. I got this little tiny butane torch, and I ran around here on the drum when the drum was on, just inside of those studs, and I heated it up, God, for like 3 minutes, for no time at all. And I went to grab it, and it wiggled. And of course I had to wrestle it off past all of the rust, but just heating it up, just with this little tiny torch, it popped right off. I touched the drum like up here, and it was like slightly warm to the touch. I didn't touch it up here while it was hot, so I don't know quite how warm it was. I don't imagine it was really that hot, but that was what did it, and that was able to crack it off of there. I don't know if you can see a problem here. Not only am I missing a brake adjuster, but as you might be able to see, this is mangled and bent. So a couple of shoes and a hardware kit, and hopefully we can throw this thing back together. This side was all right. It was missing a little bit of hardware, but you know, it has the adjuster and it works, so I'm just going to leave it. My steering was loosey-goosey, and this thing was almost undrivable at like above 45 miles an hour. So I came in here, what I did is I loosened this right there on the gearbox, that lock nut, and I tightened down that little stud in there. And actually, compared to how it was, that stud has gone in almost like a 1/4 inch. Like it was a 1/4 inch further out, sticking out. It's kind of difficult to see on that gearbox, but it's the same whether you have power steering or not. It'll be just that little, you know, the gearbox is kind of like a cylinder, and then there'll be this little piece that sticks off to the side with 4 bolts, and then right in the middle, that's actually your adjustment for how far those teeth engage. And it's the same, you know, power steering or not. Now, people tell you not to adjust those because if you get it too tight, you'll actually wear out your teeth. And those teeth are actually tapered, so they're thinner at the outside and thicker on the inside, so which allows them, to engage more when you tighten that nut. So people tell you if you tighten it too much, they'll wear out, and then you won't be able to rebuild the gearbox. However, you know, when O'Reilly offers like a remanufactured gearbox for like $40, $50, whatever it is, it's kind of a moot point because you don't necessarily need a rebuilt one. You can have a remanufactured one. And so what I did is I tightened this down all the way, you know, and I would tighten it, and I'd run the steering, start the engine, you know, run the power steering, run the steering wheel over one way, back to center, come out here, tighten it more. And every time I did that, I would move the steering wheel to the right and then back to the middle, and it would actually allow me to turn this several more turns every time I did that. So I kept doing that until I got it tight. It wouldn't go anymore. I ran the gearbox a little bit and it was still tight. And then I backed it off like half a turn, and then I tightened up that lock nut. I don't know if that's a legit thing or not. I made that up. I do know, of course, you're not supposed to get it too tight, and I think there is a specification for tightening it, but that's just what I did, and that's satisfactory for me. I don't think it'll wear out, and it actually tightens up my steering. Now this is our next problem right here. If I can turn this, if I get my toolbox off the steering wheel, you can actually see, you see that? All that slop? Yeah, this is a rag joint, or as O'Reilly calls it, a steering coupler, because if you ask them for a rag joint, they'll tell you what, and they won't be able to find you a part. But as a steering coupler, you can get a universal one, just that felt piece, manufactured by Dorman for, I think, what, $18 or maybe $12 or something like that. And actually, if you need, you can get the whole thing that includes this metal bracket on the bottom and not on the top, because of course that's attached to your steering wheel, but you can actually get that bracket piece too for a little bit more. That's like $20 or $25, but, and so that'll actually tighten up. There's actually slop in here in that rubber there. Just in case anyone wants to see, yes, I am missing brake hardware. There should be a thing that goes, a straight bar that goes across there. You should have a spring on the one side. I have the spring, I don't have the bar. Otherwise, actually, I think this side is mostly complete. The other side is missing this piece right here. This attaches to the cable for the e-brake. I think you can see it down there. And then there's a little horseshoe clip that holds, yeah, but I'm missing that entire plate on the other one, but oh, and also that bar on the other one too, of course. But I think I have enough here to work, so I'm gonna button it up. I got new pads. They're only, I know, it's just a little bit. Yeah, these are only like $20, like $19.99 plus tax for 4 for the rear, so that's not bad at all. So this rotor's okay, the other one's not, so put it back together. The old brake line had been bent so many times that, I mean, you just touch it and it would crumble apart. So, and actually it was, I noticed because it was leaking somewhere up in here. But anyway, so I got a new one. So just, you know, and actually this is too long, so what I'm gonna have to do, I wanted to make sure I had, you know, long enough so I could go all through all the bends on the differential there. So what I'm gonna have to do now, because this is too long to run it, you know, along with the differential. So what I'll do is I have a cooling loop in it, so to speak, just, you know, to take up some of that extra slack. It's getting a little late in the day, but I'm going to throw some jets in there. These are, just the standard Autolite jets. These are number 62, I believe. The ones in there are 57. Normally, if you take a 2-barrel carburetor, you can go 6 to 8 sizes oversized on the jet, and you can really make that engine scream. I went a little bit less just for fuel efficiency, but I wanted to counteract the lack of EGR, and also I wanted to richen it up from emissions, because of course, the emissions, it runs all lean. And so I believe that's in thousandths. The 62, I believe that's thousandths. 62 thousandths diameter hole, I believe. And then actually the ones in there are 57F. I do not know what the F denotes. These do not have an F on them. So we got the new ones on the bottom and the old ones on the top. If you look on the right-hand side, that's the bottom of the jet. You can see the bottom one has an ever so slightly larger hole than the top one. Now, if you look at the left-hand side, you can see actually the top one has a larger hole than the bottom one. Top one is old. The reason that has a larger hole there on the the float bowl side, the upper side, is because that hole is actually tapered. On these new ones, that hole isn't tapered, it's just a straight 62 thousandths all the way through. I don't think these are new old stock. I actually think these new ones are remanufactured. I think somebody made these. Yeah, you almost can't even read the 62. So this here is just the float bowl, and those jets just go in those 2 holes down there underneath the float next to the power valve. Turns out I'm not as slick as I thought I was. This solder joint I put on this metal pipe here, this actually started leaking just the other day. It didn't leak prior to that, it just started. It might be because the metal was dirty and the solder didn't stick to it well enough. By the way, driving a vehicle that has power steering but that isn't working is about 100 times more difficult than driving a vehicle that doesn't have power steering outright. And that's simply because this is designed for power steering. The gearing is different, and it is not easy to turn without it. But never fear, I just happen to have a spare one of these power steering hoses right in here. So I replaced this rag joint, a steering coupler, and I actually was able to do it without removing the steering wheel. Just an FYI, it doesn't matter what vehicle you have, that is never a fun process. It's always a huge pain in the ass. This gas tank had a crack in it. The last guy put JB weld on there, and that leaked. So I cleaned it off and I soldered it. So that's the result. And I'll put on screen a picture of what this looked like after I cleaned off the JB weld, but before I soldered it. Hopefully, as long as I didn't miss a spot, this should hold. And I was hoping to make a cross-country trip today, so pray to God that this gas tank works, and if it doesn't, that's going to be fun. Well, and that's the end of the Ranchero. I had a flat tire, and so, I'll show some pictures of that. And I drove on the flat tire a little bit, and I ended up having to get it towed because it wasn't running right, and I thought it ran out of gas. And so I was at the tire place, and I actually walked to get more gas for it, and I was trying to get it to go, and it didn't want to run, and I finally got it to start, and it was running okay, but it had a little bit of almost like a lope to it, almost like a misfire. It wasn't quite running right, and I was just running it just a little bit above idle, not a whole lot, just to run the alternator and charge the battery, and ended up it backfired, and I let it. I was letting it back down to idle. I think I was going to rev it just a little bit. I wasn't revving it a lot, and it backfired real loud, boom! And then it was. So what it did is it blew through a valve. It actually blew up one of the valves in there. So it no longer has valves for at least one cylinder. And of course, if I drive it like that, it'll actually crack the heads and shit. So what I had to do, instead of spending money on tires for it, I dragged it home with that tire. I wish I had gotten footage of that, but I thought of it after I was already chugga down the road. So also I didn't have power steering, and it took both hands to hold that flat tire on the straight, hold it so I didn't wander off the road. So it wasn't too far. Towed it back home. So now, before I even bother with that tire, I'm gonna have to pull both heads and get valves done, which should cost $250, assuming my heads are intact. So that's going to be fun. So consider that a bit of a conclusion to this video.
Yeah, man. There it is. So this is super crazy dangerous. That right there is Balin Mania.
and we are gonna do something really stupid today. It was a terrible idea. Balin might die. It was making me uncomfortable.
Go, Bailey!
You riding this?
What the fuck is happening?
Balin said not to talk crap about this camera. It's a piece of shit.
This is so unbelievably sketchy. Why would you put me through this, you jerk?
That's the power of really old engineering.
It'd be nice if it didn't kill me. It's not required.
I felt that fucking pop.
Make a wish, everyone. Make a wish.
Not okay.
You went too far.
This guy, man. This guy.